Welcome to Mormon Book Reviews, where an evangelical encounters the restoration. I'm your host, Stephen Peinecker, and this is going to be a very exciting interview. But before I get there, I just want to remind you, I got the latest book in yesterday in the mail for the July book giveaway, which is a preparatory redemption, reading Alma 12 through 13. And the reason why I did is because I got this two copies sent to me by Bridget Jack Jeffries, and she wrote, I actually just read her paper about called and ordained, a priesthood of all believers in Alma 13. She maintains that Alma 13 teaches the priesthood of all believers. And that, of course, she is an evangelical Christian who wrote that paper. And authors, this is how this works, okay? If you send me two copies of your book, one for my collection and one for the giveaway, and I did this unsolicited. She actually sent me money to cover the postage to send out to the winner of the book. So that's how you can get your book put on the contest. So check out this month's contest. In the description, I will have my email. Make sure you put in the subject heading July book giveaway, and also put in your address, in your name and address in the email. Sorry, Casey, U.S. residents only. All right. So I'm very excited to have Dan Vogel return to the program. And you have done a few interviews, but including one with Signature Books, of course, and my friends over at Mormonism Live. And we're going to talk about your latest book, Charisma Under Pressure, Joseph Smith, American Prophet, from 1831 to 1839. And man, this thing is a resource. Oh my goodness, I've read quite a bit of it. And I also kind of jumped around a lot throughout the book, and I would just read a section and just you get Shawshanked, you just start reading a section and then you can't stop reading. And so that was it's really a great book. So but before we get there, Dan Vogel, welcome back to the program, sir.
Thank you. Good to be back.
So
It's been a while.
It has been a while. It's been too long. I realized that I think the last time I've had you on, my channel's probably 10 times bigger since the last time I had you on my program. So for many of you who probably haven't even seen my first interview with Dan, so on the end screen, I'm actually going to have a link to that so that you could check out our very first interview, which people have told me was one of the best interviews ever done of Dan. And they really thought that yeah, I got a lot of good feedback for that interview, and because we covered a lot of things that hadn't been really talked about before and kind of fleshed out your life story. So if you want to know more about Dan's background, check out my interview with him. Dan, so I just have a few questions for you since I last saw you. Recently, I just did an interview with Curtis Weber regarding the Joseph Smith daguerreotype photograph. And you were actually one of the first people to comment on that video. Like, you watched it and you immediately commented on it. So apparently it caught your attention. And I just want to hear your opinion on what do you think of that Joseph Smith daguerreotype?
Well, I'm kind of undecided.
Okay.
There's a lot of intriguing things about it, but there's still a lot of questions about it also. I don't know if I want to go into detail about certain things, but there's certain features, facial features that still, you know, are unresolved. And I really enjoyed the interview, though, because I thought his theory about that the mods who was it that painted the Maudsley painted Joseph Smith, that he may have used the death mask, and I couldn't figure out. I thought that solved some problems, but it also raised other problems in my mind, like, well, why the upper lip, this in the center has a, an enlargement of the upper lip right there, and if why would he use the death mask in that, and if he used the daguerreotype at the same time, why would he add something that wasn't in the actual photo? Why wouldn't you prefer the photo first, and maybe explain the lip as maybe some kind of injury that happened, but yet the death mask has that bump, and the painting, and but the daguerreotype doesn't have that shape of the lip that stands out in my eyes as a pretty prominent feature.
Okay. That's interesting.
but it's an interesting, possibility. And this one photo comes down through the family, unlike some of the others.
Sure, sure. Yeah, yeah. I find the whole story to be truly fascinating, and it's very compelling. And Curtis has really done his research. And I just think of, since the last time you've been on my program, so many things have happened, and it's kind of like pretty amazing where this channel's come. And first of all, I just want to thank you that you took the time to come on my tiny little channel when you did. And I remember, actually, just so you know, folks, my interview with you kind of changed the channel. And the reason why I kind of changed the channel was, I remember it was a Saturday morning and you and I were having like an intake interview, which lasted like 3 hours long. And I remember talking with you and I was like, dude, this is the interview. So the next week we taped like a 2 or 3 hour interview and was kind of open form. In the past, I literally would have notepads for all my interviews. I'd have questions and all this kind of stuff. And I realized I didn't have to do that for my interviews, that they could be more open-ended and long form. And so your interview with me really helped, I think, made me a better interviewer as a result. And also, like people said, it really was I don't know, I felt like it was a kind of a watershed interview for the channel. So I don't know, I know you're a big deal either way, but you're a really big deal for what you did for me in the channel, dude.
Well, I was happy to do it. I mean, I think you're a pretty good interviewer, and it's fun. You know, we had fun in the 3 hours before.
That's right. That's right.
It's, so you just talk and talk and talk. So
That's right. That's how
yeah,
I.
just turn the camera on and do it.
Yeah, and the other person actually that I'm going to turn my volume down on my phone. There we go. Was, of course, you've been doing a series of interviews with my friend Stephen Murphy of Mormonism with the Murph, and I know that he's been really doing well, and I really like the channel that he has going. He's a faithful Mormon who's exploring Mormon history, and so I think those. So check out Mormonism with the Murph and his series of interviews with Dan Vogel. So I do want to talk to you about a few things. You, of course, have studied, especially the early days of Joseph Smith, and you of course, I did want to ask you before I talked about the Joseph Smith papers in the state of Ohio, doing your research on Joseph Smith. What kind of archival materials were you able to encounter, maybe in your own backyard, about Mormonism? Have you had much luck finding things about, because of course they had the Kirtland period. What kind of resources are actually in Ohio that you've been able to use for your research?
There's not really much here. Most of it's in the LDS archives in Salt Lake City. Uh, the only thing you'll get here are the civil records and newspapers.
Okay.
So it wasn't all that helpful living here, although I made many trips to Kirtland, Ohio, and a lot of tours through the temple, which I love. And uh, the the most of the stuff I had gathered long before I even started writing this biography. So I had them in my files already. Mike Marquardt came, and on our way to New York, when I was doing the doc way many decades ago, Mike Marquardt came and we took a trip to New York together to gather documents for the document 5-volume document series that I collected in the early 2000s. And we would stop by Kirtland on the way and gather documents there. So uh, I was had gathered as much as you could probably gather, you
Well,
know.
tell the audience about that 5-volume series of documents. Just explain to them what that was all about.
The 5-volume series was is called Early Mormon Documents, and it kind of covers the period from Joseph Smith's parents' births, basically, to 1831, when Joseph Smith leaves New York and goes to Ohio. So I collected everything: civil records, journals, newspapers, everything I could get my hands on, and compiled them into 5 volumes, mostly going by geographic area. The first volumes are the Smith family, all the Smith documents, and Vermont, since it's so small. And then the other volumes are from, Palmyra, Manchester area, the Harmony, Pennsylvania, and Colesville, New York area, and then finally the Fayette area.
And so a lot of this, of course, was preparatory for your later book that would be coming out, your first book on Joseph Smith. Maybe just
Yeah.
talk about that, what kind of reception you got when that book came out, because of course it came out right. You and Bushman came out within relatively close period of time. Maybe that was like the one too, really kind of shifted everything in a different direction.
Yeah, mine came out first in 2004, and I believe his 2005, Rough Stone Rolling. And I even did a critique of his biography at the Mormon History Association meeting in Vermont, I think it was. And uh, and I was surprised at how open he was, really, about a lot of matters that my biography had touched on, and he utilized a lot of my writings in his book, which I was pleased to see. And um, we kind of took a similar approach to the Smith family and saw Joseph Smith, uh, part of his motivation, at least, to launch his prophetic career was to resolve family tension and problems and division.
Yeah, that was so fascinating. Now the question then it begs the question. Now we've just had the completion of the Joseph Smith Papers project. They just released their last volume a couple weeks ago. Of course, I had Robin Jensen on and a few people from that
Yeah.
project. Maybe tell me, would you need to, now that we have all these papers, would you need to, do you feel like there needs to be a revision of your first work, or do you feel like it pretty much stands on its own merits, or do you think that the Joseph Smith Papers could actually you could do some revisions to your first edition as a result of some of the stuff they put in that collection?
No, I don't think I need to make any revisions,
Okay.
really. They just collected the Joseph Smith papers, so their scope is limited by that criteria. Um, there's still a whole other world of non-Mormons contributing to our knowledge of early Mormon origins. The what I would call the observers, of Mormon origins, not the insiders, but the outsiders, the neighbors of the Smiths, the uh, uh, non-Mormon community that they interacted with, whether it was friendly or unfriendly, still are important to consider. These are all different perspectives of the same thing going on. And if going to just friendly sources isn't going to give you the whole picture, okay? Um, and just going to the antagonists isn't going to give you the whole picture either. So, if you want to be a good historian, you got to consider all the evidence and all the different perspectives, and weigh and balance, and that takes a lot of historical methodology and source criticism and things like that to ferret out the truth of what probably happened. We never know. You never know exactly what happened, and our view is only partial, no matter how many sources you get. So anyway, I do not need to. I would have known that in the first couple of document series ones, but um, there's a little bit of nuance or shades of extra information uh, that came out, like the characters document, things like that. And I do have even I have like what I call in my files Early Mormon Documents Volume 6, where I collect documents that have since been discovered since I did my 5 volumes, and I keep track of all the new things that have come about. And I couldn't estimate how many pages that would make, but uh, there's a lot of nice sources that I wished I had at the time I was writing, but it wouldn't change any interpretation, though.
Okay. So, I do want to point out in your introduction, you say this as a biographer, Joseph Smith, I eschew binary caricatures of him. So that goes to show that your research that you're going to look at, both the friendly stuff and that's always informed your research. And so that's an important thing that you
Well, my
step.
goal is to get as close to the man, Joseph Smith, as possible, even his private life, where I usually divide uh, his public persona versus his private beliefs. And one example, quick example, would be universalism. If you read the Book of Mormon, and the people that did read the Book of Mormon understood the Mormon movement as anti-universalist in nature, that it believed in a heaven and hell and punishment and all that. And then the month that the Book of Mormon came off the press, March 1830, he's dictating a revelation concerning Martin Harris, and it says in there that the terms eternal punishment or an endless punishment do not necessarily refer to the duration of the punishment, but to the nature of the punishment, that they're synonyms for God. God
Mhm.
is eternal. That's one of his names. So whenever it says eternal punishment, it really means God's punishment. It doesn't mean that there shall be no end to this punishment. The Revelation says this is Doctrine and Covenants, section 19, by the way. So he has a private universalism, a private belief in universalism, whereas in public you would think Joseph Smith was an strictly anti-universalist. And the revelation, at the time it was dictated, you know, uh, stated that it should be kept private, that the people generally are not uh, open to the meat of the gospel, that they need actually the milk still, and that it worried that should this universalist stance be widely known, people or believers would use it as an excuse and sin and thus perish. So, um, so anyway, so I've divided between his personal beliefs that aren't always apparent and the private beliefs, like he taught that he just read the translation off the stones, to increase faith, but yet D&C 9 tells us he's working out in his mind and asking God for spiritual confirmation. So he puts out at one view, but privately has a more nuanced view than what or maybe less faith promoting view.
Yeah, your work has just really been groundbreaking in that regard. Um, it's funny because I actually have a question from Cheryl Bruno. She said, you have a lot of experience with the earliest Mormon documents before 1831. Did you feel less confident covering this period from 1831 to 1839? How long did it take to familiarize yourself with this period, and what and how did you study for it?
Well, I read the Joseph Smith papers. I read every volume, every footnote, checked every reference over a period of 2 years. Uh, and then I spent 2 years writing it because I was running out of time, or else I would be still digging. But yeah, I'm never satisfied with where how much information I've gathered. You always wish you had more time to gather even more and work out every single detail. But um, so we're working through the Joseph Smith papers, looking up the secondary sources, looking for things on my own, of course. Um, but my method is to um, make files that have every day listed in Joseph Smith's life every day. And then I start gathering documents and putting my notes, excerpts of the documents, notes, comments uh, in under each day of this calendar I make. and I just keep adding to this calendar. And then you begin to see connections that way because you're forced to live each day one day at a time, like Joseph Smith, and he doesn't know exactly what's ahead either. And so you kind of you try to live in that moment as you're trying to reconstruct it, and not assume that you know what forget what what's going to happen at the end of the story. So um that's how I that's my kind of my methodology, one part of it anyway. And it's what I'm doing with Nauvoo right now, is making my calendar. And first, of course, the most obvious place to go now is the Joe Smith papers, and I'm really grateful for the work that they did. No one person could ever do that kind of work. Um, Not even one person in a whole lifetime could not do it. That's why it takes a community of historians to produce good scholarship. No one can do it by themselves. It's just not possible. And I'm grateful that I lived during a time that this has taken place. And
Yeah, that's so true.
not just because I'm a writer, but just for my own knowledge, you know.
Another question from Cheryl was there any information you were unable to find on this period that you would like to use, or perhaps records that you didn't have access to?
Mm, uh, no, but there are some in the Nauvoo period that's coming up, like the
Ah,
William Clayton journals.
yeah.
I would love to have those. So, um, and maybe some other stuff. But you know, um, I think historians are never happy with what they have. They always want more because it casts a certain light that you couldn't see without some documents coming forth.
So this book actually takes place when they first come to Kirtland. That's the opening part of the book,
Yeah,
and that's when he introduces himself to Whitney and everything like that. So this actually opens up February of 1831. So just Joseph enters the scene going to
yeah.
Kirtland. What would you say was the most important underlying factor as to why Joseph would have relocated to Kirtland, Ohio?
Well, suddenly he had more believers in
Yep.
Ohio than he had in New York.
Yep.
And boy, I mean, that was a draw. I mean, it's impossible to resist because as soon as he got there, because of the concentration of believers, he had far more power than he could have had in New York. Because in New York, his believers were spread in several different communities. They had no clout, no political power or anything. So as soon as he got to Ohio, and he had so many believers suddenly in one place, and he had this influence over them, he had power over the elections and the government, you know, in Geauga County at the time. That's what it was at the time. Now it's Lake County. But uh and the same thing in Missouri. And this is what usually led to conflict, is that Joe Smith had this power, and the local citizens, non-Mormon community, were um, not jealous is not the word, but they were miffed at the sudden change in the balance of power that they were used to having in their community. And it's the problem with the concept of Zionism in general, of the gathering. I mean, when the Mormons were thrown out of Missouri, the advice that they gave out of Jackson County, but even out of Missouri, was that you shouldn't gather together like that. You should spread out in communities and uh, be like other churches, and not have so much power. You would not have so much conflict. So you should take this as a lesson, was what their advice was.
So I want to talk about the role also too, because this is of Sidney Rigdon. Because Sidney, of course, it's his church. He's the one that he converts. He becomes the most prominent convert to the church, and then baptized many people into his church. Thus, of course, then Joseph now has a much larger following. A lot of people. I have conversations with people who really feel like Sidney is kind of they don't really talk about him, but he played in a very pivotal instrumental role in the beginnings of the church. It's not really talked that much about in mainstream circles by the church and everything like that, but just talk about who Sidney Rigdon was and the important role he played in the church.
Well, of course, Sidney Rigdon was already hugely famous and well known in northern Ohio, especially, and other areas, even in Pennsylvania, because he was one of the three top leaders of the Campbellite movement, and known for his uh, talent as a public speaker, an orator, and um, he resisted joining. He resisted believing for a while, and at first refused to read the Book of Mormon. But then, when Parley P. Pratt, they were friends before Parley P. Pratt left Ohio and went to New York and found the Book of Mormon and Mormonism and Joseph Smith, and came when he got assigned with Oliver Cowdery and two other members to go to Missouri to preach to the Indians and find the location of the New Jerusalem. And on the way, Pratt says, "Well, let's stop by Ohio, and I want to introduce this Book of Mormon to my friend Sidney Rigdon." And they did. And Sidney Rigdon, like I said, was resistant, but he finally believed, and he stood before his congregation and announced it in a very dramatic fashion. And there were mass conversions there. The missionaries were only there for about a month, and while they were there, they baptized like 200 and some odd people, and which is like astounding. And but they were prepared people, you know, like the field is white already to harvest kind of concept, that there were already people out there waiting for a restoration of spiritual gifts.
Okay.
And especially in northern Ohio, and you should appreciate this as a Pentecostal, is that um, they believed they had started becoming disenchanted with Campbellism, because Campbell didn't believe in the restoration of spiritual gifts, and he didn't believe in having all things in common either. And there was the Morley family there in Kirtland practicing communal living, and uh, so when the Mormon missionaries came and said that it's time for restoration of the spiritual gifts, they all these um, Campbellites, disenchanted Campbellites, were excited about that, to hear that. And it was what they expected the restoration to be like, not just an adherence to strict adherence to the Bible and nothing but the Bible, And so they would look for actual spiritual manifestations when they were baptized, because the spiritual manifestation was the authority. It wasn't just Campbell believed that, and other Protestants, when they separated from Catholicism, what's your authority, for separating from Catholicism? And it was, well, the Bible commands to baptize. That is the authority, the commandment of Jesus to go out into the world and baptize. That's the authority enough. You don't need any, unbroken chain from Peter. And so uh, that was the early Mormon concept of authority, was that the Spirit, the indwelling of the Spirit, was the authority to perform the ordinances. And So when they would come out of the water, and this is a passage in the Book of Mormon, says they shall sing the praises of Jesus, in new tongues,
Mhm.
So, and that would be the sign that you indeed had been baptized and God had accepted it. And so there was this very charismatic event that was happening around Kirtland Mentor area with Cowdery and Parley P. Pratt preaching. And then um, they went on, and soon, the conversions continued to take place. They got a little carried away in their spiritual beliefs, and they got into what Joe Smith considered non-biblical forms of uh, charisma.
And this is
Like,
where Black Pete enters into the picture. This is
yeah, there's Black Pete is around. I wouldn't say it was just because of Black Pete, but uh, although some historians do think Black Pete played a pivotal part in the spiritual manifestations, but and how they got carried away, and like they would roll around and have bodily agitations, not just speaking in tongues and charismatic swoonings. So um, uh, that would prove to be one of the problems that Joseph Smith considered a problem, and they would start getting revelations themselves, like you know uh, revelations falling out of heaven and things like that, and angels appearing with their uh, conflicting instructions and revelations and things like that. So Joseph Smith had to tamp that down somewhat when he got there, which was another reason why he went there, was to rein in charisma, the expression of charisma, charismatic experiences, um, which is one of the first revelations he got when he showed up on the scene, and he labeled them as satanic in nature. That the devil was trying to deceive people, and this was one of the ways he does it. Anyway, do you have any?
so
I
I just want to get back a little bit to Sydney on this too, and
Oh,
is
excuse
that
me.
um, this is a question from one of the audience members: is what was the major factor that persuaded Sidney Rigdon, a committed Campbellite and knowledgeable biblical scholar, to join the church?
Yeah.
And because now some have speculated that there was kind of a rivalry that was going between Alexander Campbell and Sidney Rigdon, and that this was Sidney's way of trying to uh, be to branch out and do something different and be kind of a rival to Campbell. Maybe talk a little bit about what was going on there as well, and also what would have persuaded him to do this. Because why this guy knew the Bible. This guy, I mean, how, and he was a he was a born again Christian. He was a conventional Protestant in some ways, but also with a restorationist aspect that would have been kind of open to this. Maybe just talk a little bit why Sidney would have been in the first place would have gone for something like.
Well, you know this as a Pentecostal very well, that the Book of Mormon is very Pentecostal like, and that there isn't anything like outlandish in the Book of Mormon.
Well, Pentecostal reads the Book of Mormon, the great book about that. Yep.
Yeah. Uh,
That, I'm sorry,
Christopher Thomas,
Christopher,
right?
Christopher Thomas. Yep. Yep.
Yes. Yeah, I have the book as well. I haven't really read a lot of it yet. It's on my list, but uh, it doesn't have any like bizarre doctrines in it. It has just the first principles. Even Jesus, when he appears, it talks about whatever is more or less than this is cometh of the devil, kind of a thing. The faith, baptism, repentance, and the gift of the Holy Ghost kind of concept. So uh, there isn't anything Sidney Rigdon could find terribly objectionable in it.
Yeah.
It would it it um, highlights spiritual gifts and the restoration of spiritual gifts in the last days. And um, so um, um,
So,
Anyway, so Sidney Rigdon and Campbell did have falling out way before this, and Campbell wasn't terribly surprised that
hmm,
Sidney Rigdon would be taken up by this Mormon message because of the idea of spiritual gifts, and Campbell complained about Sidney Rigdon being kind of erratic in that way. Um, because Campbell knew if you go off, if you go beyond the strict right, the Bible kind of made things simple, uh, and you're trying to get rid of the traditions of men kind of thing, the additions to the Bible that Protestants saw Catholicism doing, and they were trying to wean it back. The and the belief that the reformers didn't exactly go far enough was pretty prevalent, and so Campbell took the most extreme thing is that the Bible would be the rule, the only rule, and that would narrow down a lot of things, just more or less just cut a lot of ideas and weird doctrines out, you know, and um, and so he knew that if you went the charismatic approach, that you're going to restore not only what Parley P. Pratt later said, the form of godliness, but the power thereof. Right?
mhm.
They have the form of godliness, but they deny the power thereof. Well, he knew that part, the power thereof, the spiritual manifestations would lead to splintering and sectarianism and all sorts of problems. There would be no end to the small sects that America especially could spawn, and it did anyway. you know, so um, especially in the revival period, the Second Great Awakening spawned a lot of small sects in America with their own revelations and things. Joe Smith was in a sea of other prophets that have faded into non-existence. In northern Ohio, there's this, the leather stocking prophet. He was called, and uh, in Western New York area, especially, there was, um, uh, I can't get my mind on it right now, but there was several prophets and prophetesses
Yeah.
around. There's the community of Zor here in Ohio also, but and a lot of communal experiments happening. So it was Joseph Smith is largely remembered because he tried to adapt to the and contain charisma, and he was forced to because of all these splintering and prophets spawning. He was spawning prophets of his own within his community. There was Hiram Page in Ohio getting revelations through a seer stone, identifying the location of Zion there in Western New York and the Fayette, New York area. And then later in Ohio, there was this woman whose name was Hubble, uh, doing the similar thing. And he was trying to rein that in, and just getting a revelation over and over and declaring them their revelations of the devil wouldn't work really very well, and it become pretty exhausting after a while, and inevitably there would be more and more. It would never stop until you built an institution that had its own scriptures, that had legal mechanisms in it, like the High Council or the Bishop's Court, and eventually a hierarchy. So, um, just this is what my book is about: is that this charismatic or this groups began Mormonism began as a charismatic movement, and it eventually became an institution, a more elaborate institution, and it was forced to do that in order to survive. And so I called it Charisma Under Pressure to highlight the fact that Joe Smith was responding to pressures, and that his revelations um, came about through trying to rein in charisma and build an institution. And that's why he survived another charismatic prophets didn't, because he built an institution that was self-perpetuating.
Yeah, you think of like characters like Matthias who come in, and you had the Irvingites who kind of stop in as well. So he has engagements with other groups and prophets during this period of time as well. And it's fascinating because he gave them he gave them a hearing. You know, he would sit and talk with them and engage and exchange ideas. So there was still a lot of experimentation going on as well. And I think you're right. I think that that's part of it, was that having this, being able to set up these institutions where it was important, that maybe that's why we know who Joseph Smith is. We still,
Yeah,
yeah,
200 some odd years
200
later.
years. Exactly. And so,
Because he built an institution where people were more invested in the institution itself. They had a lot to gain from this organization and lose if it broke apart.
okay.
And it was harder to break apart because you had this, the rule of faith in the published revelations. You had these councils that could judge people and handle it institutionally, rather than Joseph Smith handling it personally through revelations and charisma. So uh, most of my theory about charisma to institution and institution building comes from the German sociologist Max Weber in the turn of the last century. He wrote on institution building, charisma and institution building,
And he
and
even wrote about
they're
Joseph Smith.
it's very predictable, and it's Max Weber has a huge influence on studies of institutions today. Even they scholars use his principles and ideas to map out the evolution of various groups, not just religious groups, but businesses, military leaders, heroes of all sorts of different types. That a charismatic leader could be like Steve Jobs, starting his business, and how it slowly evolved and perpetuates itself. Um, so anyway, just what Joseph Smith did was a very predictable manner, and the various ways that institutions can be threatened, like for Joseph Smith in a religious setting, is because it was a millenarian group as well, predicting the end of the world, and was highly charged up by the events that were happening at the time, both political and religious, the Second Great Awakening and the election of Andrew Jackson, who was a Mason, who tapped into, especially in Western New York, the anti-Masonic furor that was going on there in the wake of William Morgan's murder in 1826. That when actually Andrew Jackson suffered in Western New York during the 1828 election and campaign. Um, and a lot of religious conservatives thought it was the end of the world, or at least the American experiment of government. And now that a Mason, who is a king, you know, a Masonic king, and uh, the secret combination, which they believed was infiltrating government, it would be like, McCarthyism, and the communists infiltrating the government, and you never know where they are. It's the boogeyman in the deep state, right, of of masonry in our government, or communism, and for periodically these things crop up, and Joseph Smith happened to be right on the tip of that wave, and which finally died out and disappeared in Mormon rhetoric. No one in Nauvoo really talked about, the the masonry taking over the government. It kind of fizzled out after Jackson left office, and the end of the world hadn't come. And in 1832, William Wirt, he was the first third party in America, right? The anti-Masonic party that didn't do so well. It kind of fizzled out also. Mormons were forced to become pro or supporters, let's say, of Jackson in Ohio and Missouri because of the anti-Mormons were also Whigs, and and they were anti-Masons, anti-Jackson. They were anti-Jackson, anti-Mason. In Western New York, especially, was one and the same thing. But uh, so there was this millennial uh, excitement going on, and that's what gave the energy behind Joseph Smith and why people wanted to leave the United States and go and build a Zion, a theocratic government, basically, which was originally intended to be put into Indian territory, and convert the Indians, but they were kicked out of Indian territory. And so they settled on Independence, Missouri. And so why would people want to leave the United States, such a great place, right, to live, the greatest nation in the world and all that kind of stuff? Why would they want to go leave the United States and go and build this utopian society in the wilderness, basically, in outside the United States originally? But so that's what was Joseph Smith's mission. Why did people attach themselves so readily to it and want to follow his plan, which was challenged from the very beginning, and that is pressure on the charisma of Joseph Smith. And so he had this change from your basic idea of charisma to charisma of office.
Okay.
And which is what Max Weber talks about, is that you've finally transitioned from the instability of personal charisma
Okay.
to the charisma of that office and authority. And this is in the mid 1830s, is when angelic ordinations were being introduced, and a whole rewriting of Joseph Smith's history, and a push towards a legal concept of authority that had been restored actually literally through angels, instead of some charismatic endowment like a Pentecostal endowment, which is what was originally conceived as authority, to one that had actual chain like the Catholics, and it was harder to split off. And in my book you'll learn that there's this constant tension between the Missouri church, run by Bishop Partridge, and later by the presidency of the High Council, David Whitmer, John Whitmer, and W.W. Phelps. There's this tension between that authority there and the authority in Ohio. And the introduction of angelic ordinations is what united the two, and that it was harder to break off because you would break the chain. And I
So
quote Brigham Young in there.
I do have a question, because
Yes.
a lot of people say like there's this evolution of the, from the like the first vision gets a little more elaborate as time goes on, and that they have these, now we have angelic visitations. Let me just read you a couple of quotes from newspapers at the time. On December 7th, 1830, in the Painesville Telegraph, it says Mr. Cowdery had his commission directly from the God of heaven, and that he has credentials written and signed by the hand of Jesus Christ, with whom he had personally conversed. And another one, the Reflector, February 14th, 1831, Smith, they affirmed, had seen God frequently and personally. Cowdery and his friends had frequent interviews with angels. So it does seem to me that we actually do have some of this stuff actually early on as well.
Well, okay, so the authority in the first years of the church was based on angelic appearances, the ministration of angels, not the ordination by angels.
Okay.
The angel appearing, like if you read Doctrine and Covenants 20, which is the Articles and Covenants of the Church of Christ, the authority comes from the commandments Joseph Smith received from the angel. Like I was mentioning, the Protestant view that authority comes from the commandment, God's commandment, from the Bible, whereas the charismatic restorers believe that it came from direct revelation. And so Oliver Cowdery would say this, that how can a people that don't believe in revelation have authority? You know, because it doesn't just come from the Bible. It comes from a revelation direct to them from God. So it's still a spoken authority. The angel speaks it, or God speaks it through the revelation. And that's why they emphasize the book of commandments, and they are getting commandments from God by revelation, and that is the authority. Or the angels appear, like it was Moroni later, right, in connection with the gold plates. Moroni commanded Joseph Smith to translate, that his mission is to translate this work. That is the authority to do it. Okay. Then the early concept of when Joseph Smith baptized Oliver Cowdery, and Oliver Cowdery baptized Joseph Smith on May the 15th, 1829 in Fayette, in Susquehanna County, Pennsylvania, is that, and Lucy tells this version of it, that they got up one morning and the commandment appeared in the stone to baptize one another. And that was the authority, and they went out and did it. The angel being added to that account comes later. No one heard anything about angelic ordinations for the first 4 or 5 years of the church's existence. That means they were baptizing, ordaining each other, functioning as a church. No one knew, as far as we know, about, John the Baptist ordaining Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery to baptize each other, or Peter, James, and John coming and restoring the keys of the apostleship. They didn't restore the Melchizedek priesthood, by the way. The Peter, James, and John restored the keys of the apostleship, which was a story that first appeared in the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants after the 12 apostles had been organized in February of 1835 to justify ordaining 12 apostles. That's what Peter, James, and John related to, not the restoration of the Melchizedek priesthood. The Melchizedek priesthood was restored in June 1831, in the June 1831 conference, when the high priesthood was restored without any angelic ordinations. That's the history of the church itself says that was the first time the Melchizedek priesthood was manifested with the high priesthood. That's that Alma chapter 13, the priesthood of all believers, and God preordaining high priests, so when it talks about angels and they getting commissions in writing, no less, from Jesus Christ to preach the gospel, it's not the same as being ordained by angels. It's being commissioned by angels appearing. The ministration of angels was the authority to proceed. And that's what the Articles and Covenants, or D&C 20, talks about. Notice in the foundational document of the church, the Articles and Covenants do not mention John the Baptist or Peter, James, and John. Why? It doesn't. Section 22 talks about people that hesitated to be rebaptized because they had already made a covenant to Jesus. It doesn't say, well, you have to be rebaptized because you were not baptized by authority. It just says you can't put new wine into old bottles, and that the old covenants are done away, meaning God recognized it up until now. He recognized these baptisms until now, because some people they had been baptized already and they made a covenant with God through their baptism, and they didn't want to go lessen that previous covenant that they made with God. And so the reason wasn't, oh, you were baptized without authority. So you need to be baptized with authority now. No, it's old covenants are done away. This is a new covenant, the new and everlasting covenant, you know. So now you're entering the new covenant. There was, at this early stage of the history of the church, there wasn't, there, the restoration wasn't the same as the concept of restoration that we have now, or after the angelic ordinations were introduced. Once you introduced the angelic ordinations, that changed the whole concept of what restoration was. Um, it wasn't the restoration of charisma or that spiritual authority or gifts. It now was a chain. It was, there was a great apostasy and there was a chain. It broke. It changed the nature of what apostasy was also. And there was always, it just the Puritan concept of a church was the invisible saints becoming visible, okay, by covenanting in these congregations. Um, there's always believers out there, and they were scattered in all the churches. And the Puritans wanted to gather these pure churches. In early Mormonism, the emphasis was on purity, and because you had to be pure to have the Spirit, and the Spirit was the authority. And if you weren't pure, you didn't have the authority to act as an elder, even. And um, that's where charismatic authority becomes a little shaken after you learn that this leader might be not as perfect and pure. And so there's a tendency for Joseph Smith to want to shift to the charisma of office. And that's, he eventually becomes president of the high priesthood, then president of the high priesthood over all the church, then president of the church, you know. And he becomes he has authority vested in him by his office, not by his purity.
You know, you mentioned early on in the book too that the charisma is not only something that is something that you exude, but it's also, the charisma is actually the way the followers perceive him, that they actually project charisma onto the person as well. So that's kind of when you talk about charisma, it's not just Joseph being a charismatic individual, it's also how the response of the followers are having, and they're putting that charisma on the man as well. Because you even talk about how he wasn't the best orator. Sidney Rigdon was the orator. That he didn't have all the qualities you would necessarily think of in a modern sense of what a charismatic leader is. But it does. But then you also look at other people who are like CEOs of corporations that maybe they don't have a great personality, but they're charismatic because of the position
Yeah.
they're in. So there's a lot of dynamics going on in this terminology of charisma.
Well, it's built by various different ways. Joseph Smith used various, his power of language when he would dictate the Book of Mormon, or his revelations seemed miraculous to other people. And that was one way to build charisma. There are other ways that my book talks about. There are some miracles like healings that take place that may, probably have naturalistic explanations. But I speak of in my introduction of the social construction of charisma. And this is not right up Max Weber's way of thinking. It's other scholars that I draw on that have studied charisma in political situations also, and how it's manufactured. There's certain political leaders around us that some people think have charisma, and other people see just the opposite. And the same thing with Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith wasn't charismatic to everyone who met him. Some people thought he was just an ordinary farm, boy, and didn't really impress them all that much, and couldn't see what other people saw in him. So the charisma is kind of manufactured as a symbiosis between the leader and the followers, and it is somewhat projected onto him. So the charismatic leader attracts certain kinds of people and not others. And so I lost my train of thought there, where I was going to go with this.
Well,
But
I just want to talk about the, like, okay, so then you're talking about the structures and everything like this. So now what we're going to kind of talk a little bit about the decision to go what were the influences on Joseph to actually pursue communal living. This was an early concept that was going on. What was the impetus for that? What do you think was what caused Joseph to pursue that path?
so the Book of Mormon talks about it, just like the Book of Acts in the Bible talks about they had all things in common. And that socialistic kind of concept was prevalent in the United States. There was various groups, both religious and secular versions of this utopian kind of communal living. Sometimes it involved even marriage, concept. You get into spiritual wifery kind of concepts in some groups. If you have all things in common, does that include each other? You know, Nobody owns anything, not even your wife, kind of,
Mhm.
So, and it's a very experimental time in American history that, it's hard to repeat, you know, in our present circumstances, although there are some around still, people do try. And uh, when Joseph Smith arrived in Ohio, uh, there was the Morley family practicing communal living. They had a group of cabins there to the east of the Whitney store. And they may have even indulged in this spiritual wifery, or actually, it kind of, the section 42, the law of the Lord, the law of the Lord thing kind of hints at there's a concern there that people not put away their wives so easily. And I read into that possibility of some kind of what you would call polygamy, or that you could leave and switch partners very easily, maybe in this commune. But the polygamy does crop up even, quite early in the Kirtland uh, experience.
And just since you brought it up, what do you think that the idea of polygamy was already developing in Joseph's mind at this time?
Well, the Book of Mormon hints at it very strongly,
Mhm.
where Jacob 2, everybody quotes as sounding anyway, anti-polygamy, but it does leave a loophole
Yep.
in there for unless the Lord commands it.
Mhm.
So uh, there's a concern there for what Brian Hales calls unauthorized polygamy, you know, that it had to be controlled by either by the church, or it has to be God,
Mm.
um, God commanding it. And once you set up an institution, of course, it's going to come through the leader. But
Okay.
so Joseph Smith controlled the keys of that. And so you get section 101 of the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants that was probably authored by Oliver Cowdery. That, and it's an anti-polygamy statement in there. Section 101 was mostly there so that they would have a um, statement, official statement, which was required by a law in order to have a license to perform marriages in Ohio. You had to have some kind of official declaration of your intent to perform marriages, public marriages. And so then they inserted, due to the rumors that the Church of Jesus Christ sanctions, or the Church of the Latter-day Saints, it was, sanctions polygamy. This is not true, that they believe in having but one wife, kind of statement. I don't know the exact wording off the top of my head, but um, so they did do that, and there were trials of membership, one or two, that cut off members for actually trying to practice polygamy even before 1835.
Hmm.
So it was that period of time when these ideas were floating around, and um, the church decided to take a stand officially,
Mhm.
anyway, against it.
Okay. Well, I think also what's probably one of the most important things going on in this period of time is the idea of building a temple. And can you shed light on Joseph's initial intentions for the construction of the temple? What do you think were his motivations to do that? Where did this idea come from? And is this part of his trying to, again, this is the naturalistic explanations of what we're kind of dealing with here in the book. Is another way of trying to consolidate power? What do you suppose was what was the initial thrust to actually build a temple?
Well, I'm not exactly sure if it was, you know, strictly a religious thing. They called it the
Okay.
house of the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
And it was not viewed as like a temple, like Mormons view temple nowadays.
Right.
Uh, it
Yes.
was it was just a meeting house,
Mm-hmm.
the house of the Lord, where they went to worship and to study, to learn, um, to have the school of the prophets, to have meetings. Um, uh, they did use it to perform ordinances like washing of feet. Um, uh, there was nothing really secret going on
It's
in
true.
there.
Yeah.
No secret ordinances. It was all ordinances, that washings, and washings of feet, and washings of the body, perfuming the body, but basically taken out of the Old Testament. But it does have some interesting flavoring in there from ceremonial magic. Um, so why build a building, especially when you can't afford it?
Right. Exactly.
Um, and I think it's a thing to unite around, to fundraise, to donate time, um, a project of building. It's kind of a bizarre in my mind, since they're supposed to be going on to Missouri, you know, and then Joe Smith gets an 1831 revelation, September 11th, 1831, a revelation that talks about Kirtland being in a stronghold for 5 years. And then they start building a temple. It takes longer than that to actually finish. So it took longer than they expected, probably. But still, why? It's kind of a mystery. Why build the temple? Um, and then Joe Smith starts commanding the Independence Church to build a similar temple, not only one, but two at least. Um, and to plan, in Jackson County, they're still in Jackson County. They haven't gotten thrown out. In 1833, there's already planning to build a temple there in Jackson County, Missouri, and sending plans for the city, what the city Zion's supposed to look like, took that ignored the present situation of the village of Independence and all the things and roads and terrain and everything. It was just a square that was kind of just a conceptual thing, but they sent it as if it were a plan, actual plan for a city that was not terribly pragmatic to,
It's
I
interesting.
talk about, oh, sorry.
Oh, well, actually, it actually leads to a question. One of my somebody had asked me for me to ask you on Reddit, and that was one question I've had for a while is why did Smith stay in Kirtland so long? Why would he have not moved to Zion shortly after it was identified as such? Why do you suppose he stayed and didn't head out sooner?
Because of the hostility that was there, because I don't think he understood how rural it was until he went there in 1831 on his first visit there. I don't think Emma was keen, actually, on going to the wilderness next to the Indians. And I think she liked Kirtland. And I think Joseph Smith made some sort of provision so that there would be time to gather and build it up before he would go there. It would be smart. It's a smart thing to do, was to allow it to mature somewhat. Um, Before you went there, um, you would avoid a lot of potential danger and failure as a charismatic leader. He did experience failure. Their charisma actually was in trouble deeply from the very beginning of the Missouri experience. He made a huge mistake, I think, in designating and by revelation an exact location where the temple would be built. And once he did that, there was no backing out, no changing plans, nothing. And when the Missourians revolted against that, he was stuck. His people were stuck in that one location. It would have been much better if he would have just gave a commandment to build a city, Zion, in a more general area. He should have picked some place where nobody lived, but that might have been too much for him or Emma to deal with, going into a wilderness situation like the Mormons eventually did to go to Utah. But um, so who knows what the factors were, but there's a lot of forces and things to consider, as a leader of a whole group of people, um, that maybe he wasn't used to.
So in 2002, you put out your paper in American Apocrypha, and hold on one second. I want to get the book. Yeah, yeah, American Apocrypha, and you basically suggest in here that when Joseph Smith kind of hypnotized the three witnesses, I want to bring that up in addition to the idea of the spiritual manifestations that were happening at the temple as also a type of hypnotism as well. What do you say about that? What do you still stand by this, that Joseph was hypnotized the witnesses to see the plates, and what role possibly could have psychedelics? Of course, Bryce Blankenagel talks about this, the role that psychedelics could have played in some of these spiritual manifestations, especially in the temples, with the opening of the temple. Can you just address those as well?
Okay, so I use the term hypnotism because it wasn't very, there isn't a handy term, but um, would be like uh, uh, trying to show that, um, what happened to the three witnesses and the eight witnesses. Is there a naturalistic explanation for that? Is there a naturalistic explanation for visions generally, not just Mormons? Um, and there's the added problem of multiple uh, hallucinators,
Mm-hmm.
or apparently multiple, because it's not so clear that they all saw the same exact thing. Um, so I was introducing the idea, and so I don't think you can use the witnesses by themselves as some kind of proof for the Book of Mormon. That the real questions about the Book of Mormon should center on the historicity of the Book of Mormon, because that's easier to test. Um, so, and historians do that all the time, is test books. Are they forgeries? Are they pseudepigraphic? Or is it real history? Where was it really written in ancient America? That's much easier to test than to test the witnesses and what the witnesses experienced. So if the Book of Mormon's not history, if if I decide as a historian the Book of Mormon's not history, then that means the witnesses hallucinated or they're lying.
Okay.
But I don't think they're lying.
Mm.
I think so I assume that they hallucinated. You can't start with, oh, the witnesses all saw the same thing, therefore the Book of Mormon's history.
Okay.
That's kind of a backwards way of solving a problem. You start, like I said, with is the Book of Mormon history? Well, if it's not history, then there were no Nephites. And if there were no Nephites, then wasn't a Moroni that and a Mormon that made plates, and Joseph couldn't have had any plates. And Moroni couldn't have appeared to Joseph Smith to tell him where the plates were. So what's going on? And um, so with the witnesses, I decided to tackle that. And I knew that it's more complicated than the simple testimonies imply. So you have these testimonies that preface the first edition. They were in, or at the end, or I forget now. I think they're at the end.
They were in the first
At the 1830 edition. You're just hit with those statements, and they're undated. They don't give any background to how these affidavits were created. And so, how did it actually happen? So, if you read the first testimony of three witnesses, you would get the impression that these three men were just by themselves. It doesn't say that they were all together, even or separate. It just says they testify that an angel showed them the plates. Well, were they all together? Or showed them when? How? You know, you don't get the idea that Joseph Smith was there also until Joseph Smith, describes the event in his 1838 history. Finally, you get a little glimpse of where this document came from. And so, according to Joseph Smith, they went out into the wilderness near the Whitmer farm house, and they had this event happen. But Martin Harris left, so it's only Joseph Smith, Oliver Cowdery, and David Whitmer. So it's not three witnesses together. And Joseph Smith then left them and went to Martin Harris. And Joseph Smith says, and the angel appeared again and showed the plates. At least it was the same to me, the same vision that had occurred before. So Joseph Smith is the one creating the link of sameness between the other two and Martin Harris. Yet David Whitmer said on one of his interviews, I don't think Harris saw all that we saw. So you don't learn that also in this vision there's a table, and on the table are the other sacred relics like the Leahona, the brass plates, the sword of Laban, you know. And some people like Richard Anderson assumed that it was just a natural supernatural experience, meaning they were in the woods or in a clearing actually, and the angel appeared and everything was the same in the natural world. It was just the angel added to the natural world and he was physically there, in the wilderness turning these leaves. But you learn from David Whitmer, a very good interview uh, um, Doyle, Moyle, excuse me, Moyle, Henry James Moyle. Sorry, there's so many. David Whitmer was the most interviewed witness, and so there's so many. But this guy was returning from school, being trained as an attorney in law. So his interview of David Whitmer is exceptional because this guy knew what questions to ask. And he was asking, he wanted to know what type of experience it was. Was it supernatural, or was it just purely, like Richard Anderson thinks, a natural, supernatural experience? And David Whitmer said there was a soft haze.
Hmm.
Everything around us changed. And it wasn't like superimposed on the natural world. Although, you can hallucinate that way also, but this way, once you add an artificial light, a glory, and that the natural world disappeared and all that, you then add the element of possibility, that it was a hallucination. So you can't tell the difference theoretically between a vision and a hallucination. And I maintain I don't need to make that decision. All I have to do is decide if the Book of Mormon is history or not, and that's uh, leads to where I come down.
Where you come. So I did want to. So this is what's interesting to me too, because of course we have the idea of them seeing things through their mind's eye, and this ties into the Kirtland period as well. But because a couple of things happened. First of all, you had the co-vision in Doctrines and Covenants 76, where Joseph was and Sidney Rigdon were kind of having like a shared vision. And then it seems to me it's almost like the way it's constructed is almost suggestive, like, well, I see this, do you? Which was very similar to 1825 when Joseph was peering with his colleague into the hill Cumorah, describing what they were seeing. And then they were kind of, one would describe something and the other would describe it. So is this kind of how this all would have worked with people suggesting things and then they would see it in their mind's eye? Is this how how he would have done the hypnotism?
Okay, so I missed part of your statement about it was similar to the hill Cumorah.
Well, no, in 1825, remember when Joseph and his peer,
Oh yeah, with
yeah,
Samuel
yeah.
Lawrence. Yeah,
So
okay, so yeah.
would you maybe compare and contrast the co-visionary experience that Sidney would have had with Joseph with that as well?
Yeah, the Samuel Lawrence 1825 uh, visit to the hill Cumorah. Samuel Lawrence was also a seer among the treasure diggers in the Manchester area. And according to Willard Chase's account, they went up on the hill, and Joseph Smith said, "This is where the plates are." And Samuel Lawrence took out his seer stone and looked. And Joseph Smith says, "Do you see the plates?" And he goes, "Yes, I see the plates, but I also see a large pair of spectacles there also. Do you see them?" And Joseph Smith at first said no, and then he goes, "Well, look again," you know. And Joseph Smith looks again, and then he says, "Yes, I see them." Okay, so my interpretation of that is that Joseph Smith needed a second witness to the plates. He's getting this through Samuel Lawrence. Samuel Lawrence is saying, "Yes, but I see something you don't see," you know. And he was one-upping Joseph Smith in a way that my seer stone's more powerful because I saw him. He didn't see him until he looked twice, you know. So there's that, and there's that question and answer back and forth thing that you recognized, and then Philo Dibble described the 76, the 3 degrees of glory vision, uh, as a joint vision between Joseph and Rigdon. And Rigdon was a charismatic person. Actually, we didn't mention this, but he did suffer from depression, and he also had a significant head injury
Mhm.
growing up. That his um, son, I believe it was, talked about that, and some others mentioned that Rigdon had this peculiar personality quirk with visionary experiences. And so, what I talk about when I do mention my hypnotic thesis with the witnesses, it's a very complex issue. And I use hypnosis because that's what we call it nowadays. They wouldn't have called it that then. And Brian Hales says, well, mesmer, they called it mesmerism after 1840 in America, that is, because mesmerism came to America in the 1840s, and Brian Hales would say, oh, they didn't even know about hypnotism. I go, well, that's just what they called it. Hypnotism or trance states have been achieved for thousands of years through various means, through normal means or chemical means, through drugs like psilocybin and ketamine and other kinds of drugs, uh, or just naturally through repetitive praying, uh, fasting, lowering the blood sugar, uh, and you can hallucinate. Anybody can hallucinate. It was more prevalent in um, be they've noticed, psychologists have noticed that visionary experiences have decreased over time as people understand
Mm.
uh, how the brain works and how you can hallucinate. It becomes harder to do that. You're not in a culture, a visionary culture, as Bushman called it, that tries to um, cultivate the ability to do that. If you did, you went down that road and you tried to cultivate that, you would uh, be more readily attuned to those kinds of things and being able to do those kinds of things, getting into those kinds of states. It's a talent, or an ability that humans have that just don't cultivate that
Okay.
anymore.
And
You know.
actually that couple things. I took a flight and I was sitting next to a professional hypnotist and I was talking to her about it. She says, I said, is hypnotism really anything, or is this kind of some kind of parlor trick? And she goes to me, she says, no, Steve, we hypnotize each other all the time. She says that it's actually more common than you realize. Like people who like they lie to their spouses, or they gaslight people, or they plant suggestions in their minds. That it's
Mhm.
actually something that happens much more frequently than we realize. So it wasn't like, oh, we didn't know about mesmerism until 1840. People have been hypnotizing each other unknowingly for all these times. But to give you another example, I remember I was like in high school, or maybe I was probably high school, and I was laying in bed, and I remember I was half asleep, and I remember waking up and seeing a black hooded figure at the foot of my bed. And for about 2 seconds, I really, really believe that there was a black hooded figure at the foot of my bed. I screamed bloody murder. It was a terrifying experience. And then I woke up. I finally turned the lights on, and I reflected, and I thought, oh, wait a second. I was in like that stage of sleep where you kind of have between that we have psychology. We now know
Yeah,
that that's
yeah.
something that happens. But if I didn't know that, I would have been absolutely convinced that I saw that hooded figure, and that would have stuck with me for my entire life. But because I understood how psychology and how things how our mind works, and how it functions when you're like half asleep, that does happen. And so
Yeah.
so we do have more tools now to use, so we wouldn't necessarily fall for these experiences that definitely can come with naturalistic explanations. Getting back to just real quick, you brought up psilocybin and all these other things. Do you think that there were any of these things? Like some people have, like Bryce Blankenagel, have said that that Joseph may have spiked the wine, and that's why they had all these mass hallucinatory things. Do you think that's necessary to introduce hallucinogenics into the thing, or can you just say that, or do you think that there was none used?
Well, I call it an unnecessary hypothesis because there's so many natural ways to
the
accomplish the same thing, and I don't see any evidence of it. I feel that they're trying to force something into a round peg into a square hole kind of a thing. Um, I'm not saying that it never happened ever, but to say that there's some kind of conspiracy of just misspiking the wine in the Kirtland Temple endowment is well, it's unnecessary. You're Are you going to make that same hypothesis with all those revivals and people,
right,
hundreds of people falling down
right.
and you know having bodily agitations? No, I don't think you would. I, in my view, it's a modern mind can't comprehend what was going on in previous ages.
Yeah.
And so there it's presentism. It's, well, that's how I would do it. That's how we would, it's a real naturalistic explanation. Forget about all the, psychological studies on this subject. I've uh, uh, um, talked to Blankenegger, or however you say his
Bryce
name.
Blankenagel, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Bryce. I talked to him before about it, and I did suggest to him that he read. There's all sorts of books on religious, psychological, biological principles behind religious experience. It's a part of the brain that you can tap into in a natural way through prayer, through fasting, through fatigue. Uh, Sensory deprivation. I have a book on hallucination, a technical medical book on hallucination, and there's like 50 different ways of doing it.
Hmm.
And drugs are only one way of doing it.
And and
So,
I, and I have to, even speaking from personal experience now, of course, I come from the charismatic Pentecostal tradition, and I've seen a lot of things. And some of it now I know that, and also being an atheist for a long time and a skeptic, and I still think like a skeptic, I still think like an atheist. Recently, I was in a church service where this visiting evangelist was coming, and he had this. He wanted for people to be able to speak in tongues. He actually had them go through these steps,
yeah,
and he had him go, and he explained to him what he was doing, and then he was, and I'm sitting there in the audience thinking, oh, this guy's totally manipulating this group of people, and by golly, these people start speaking in tongues. So
yeah,
now, of course, as a Christian, I'm like, as a believer, I have to take that into account, that I can sit here in this church service right now and see how everything that I just saw, I can come up with a naturalistic explanation of what happened. And I didn't see him spike the wine or anything like that. So I definitely can see how it can be done totally, just with naturalistically, without
suggestion,
the power of suggestion.
the
And that's
power of
exactly what
suggestion.
it was, the power
Yeah.
of suggestion. I saw it in firsthand just about a month ago, and I'm like, oh, I see what this guy's doing.
Or the minister that touches you when you fall back,
Yep.
the falling power, the power, you're
Yep.
touched with the power and you fall backwards,
Yep.
and it's suggestion. It's a situation and suggestion there. In stage hypnotism is not the same thing I'm talking about.
Right.
And Brian Hales has the watch thing,
Mhm.
the watch
Right.
pendulum going back and forth. I'm hypnotized. Well, all of that is just a social construction of getting into the spirit, the altered state of consciousness. And mesmerism, they use magnetism, and it's all trappings in order to get you. The hypnotist isn't doing it. First of all, you're doing it to yourself. Okay, the hypnotist has no power, to do anything. It's you doing it yourself. But when there's authority figure, you know, there is this psychological state you can enter into that is very much, some psychologists have studied hypnotism. What kind of state it is? Is it going back to your childhood and your parent authority figure kind of a thing, when you're in this state of total obedience, and um so getting back to the Sidney Rigdon, Joseph Smith apparently joint vision,
Mhm.
is that according to Philo Dibbo, Joseph Smith says, I see this, and Sidney says, I see it too. And Sidney says, I see this, and Joseph Smith says, I see it too. It suggests that they're both suggesting to each other what they see next, and that it's kind of being constructed. Also, after the experience, Joseph Smith is in control of the written version of what happened.
Mhm.
And it says 1,000th part of what we experience we cannot write. Well, so Joseph Smith writes what he wants to have people believe they saw, and leaves out a bunch of stuff. And it gives the impression that they're both seeing the same thing. The written version of it is not is not what really happened at the time and place. So there is that illusion of unity as the same thing. We get back to the witnesses of the Book of Mormon. You have two documents that implies unity, okay? And we learn that the unity starts getting a little fuzzy when Joseph Smith tells the story later in 1838, that we learn that Martin Harris wasn't there, that he didn't see it with the other two. So we don't have four people seeing the same thing. That's total assumption people are making on their part. And why would Joseph Smith, reveal such a thing? Well, Abner Cole in the Palmyra Reflector talked about how he thought the description of the plates that David Whitmer and Martin Harris gave were different.
Mm.
That they didn't seem to have the same description of the plates, uh, and so that suggests, in David Whitmer's statement that I referred to earlier, that Martin Harris may not have seen everything that we saw, that it maybe wasn't the same, and then Joseph Smith saying, well, at least it was the same to me, you know, um, that there might not be the unity that we are assuming. The same vision happened in both places. And there's also an assumption that both, even Oliver Cowdery and David Whitmer, did they see the same thing? I mean, they may have seen an angel with plates turning the plates, but was it exactly the same? Who knows? Okay, did they look on the table and was everything exactly the same in the same arrangement on the table or whatever? And I would also suggest that Joseph Smith is the guide, that Martin Harris had to wait for Joseph Smith to get there in order to have his vision. And that, did it happen similar to the witnesses as what happened with Sidney Rigdon? Did Joseph Smith say, I see the angel? And they say, I see the angel too. I see the angel with the plates. He's turning the plates. Now he's testifying to whatever. And that they are following his lead in this vision. So David Whitmer kind of hints that when the vision occurred, that they were praying, nothing happened. They were sitting on a log, discussing, talking, and then suddenly the vision starts happening. So Joseph Smith, they are talking, conversing at the time the vision begins. And so there's might be a whole lot left out. And it seems to me that the published testimony of the three witnesses and eight witnesses is intentionally sparse, without details, that it's trying to unify various experiences. They're only saying, I saw the angel, I saw the plates, the angel did testify to us. That's it. Okay, so there is also another concept that I brought up out of the Book of Mormon, the difference between uh, the tree of life vision experienced by Lehi and Nephi. That Nephi brings up that my father being carried away in vision didn't notice that the waters were filthy and the fountain was filthy, and that it represented the depths of hell. So they had the same vision, but separately. But they're Nephi is saying that it was the same vision. I saw the same vision, but he didn't notice this or mention this, but this is what I noticed. So you can have various people can have be together and have visions and see different things. And then in Kirtland endowment, everybody they Father so and so saw the angel come in and whatever. So but other people didn't see the angel. And everybody's having very, very different religious experiences, even in other meetings that people testify, like the priesthood meetings in the Kirtland Temple endowment before the Kirtland dedication. The priesthood holders are having visions, and they're describing what each of them saw. So this person saw this person saw that. It's all different, and they have no problem. This person saw an angel. I didn't see the angel, but the angel was there. It was open to his mind, but it wasn't open to my mind. And it's everybody allows that difference. Okay. And it can be still a true experience, and that you see only what your God wants you to see, or you're worthy to see, or you're attuned to see. So, like I said, they're unifying experiences. And the 8 witnesses make it sound like it was all a totally naturalistic experience with the plates. But subsequent statements, just like subsequent statements by the 3 witnesses, open our eyes to, hey, there's a lot more to this than this bare bone statement. The 8 witnesses, John Whitmer being one of them, is quoted as saying that he had seen them by the power of God. And that implies that there's something more to the experience than these plates sitting on a log or whatever in the wilderness, and they're just turning these leaves over and looking at them in a naturalistic way. It doesn't make any sense for the D&C 17, which promises the 3 witnesses a view of the plates through the eye of faith, and then several days later showing the plates in a naturalistic way. Doesn't make any sense to me. It doesn't fit. And that no one can see them. That's what the Revelation says, D&C 17. No one can see them except through the eye of faith. Even Joseph Smith hasn't seen them except through the eye of faith. So then you have the 8 witnesses come along and seeing them with the naturalistic eye. That's what we're assuming when we read the testimony of 8 witnesses. And that's why I've argued that you cannot do a reconstruction of the historical event from the published testimony of 8 witnesses. It doesn't work. My examination of the 3 witnesses shows that that's a dangerous thing to do.
Well, I'll tell you, this is
So,
this this is great. I love it. And of course, we're talking.
Okay.
We're always going to talk about the Book of Mormon. It's always going to happen. Even if it doesn't necessarily cover the period, of course. But of course, there's so much else going on in this period of time, and I don't know if we're going to be able to touch all of it. Of course, we got the Book of Abraham comes into the picture with the mummies and everything like that, which is a fascinating story. We have the Fanny Elger affair. Why don't we talk a little bit about that? Actually, one person asked the question: what is most likely of the Fanny Elger situation? Was the Fanny Elger incident an early attempt by Joseph Smith to practice polygamy? I think that's one of those questions that people always wonder. Was this an early attempt, or was this an affair?
It's hard to say because the type of sources that we have. We know it happened because of the reaction of Oliver Cowdery.
Right.
And it's in the minutes of the Far West record. of Oliver Cowdery accusing Joseph Smith, it's there. I mean, uh, it occurred. Okay, something happened. The nature of it is not so clear, um, and so there, like I mentioned, the Book of Mormon had allowed polygamy under certain circumstances, God sanctioning it. Um, did he have an affair and just kind of well, he never really talked about it himself, right? He never explained, oh, we were married or anything. So, and Fanny went on and married a non-Mormon just months later after leaving the Kirtland area. So she didn't think there was some kind of formal divorce needed. Um, so, but what didn't happen is it it didn't it went on for quite a while, by the way. It didn't just wasn't one thing.
Okay.
Okay. The when Emma Smith kicked Fanny out of the house, she went and lived with the Webb family. And the Webb family, the Chauncey Webb, implied that she was pregnant, although she probably wasn't. We have no evidence that she was pregnant. Um, but his thinking that she was pregnant implies that it was his understanding that it had gone on for several months at least. And she was a live-in maid for quite a while in the home. And Eliza R. Snow, it was also living in the home at the time. And later, when she actually became a plural wife of Joseph Smith and Nauvoo, she finally understood. She didn't understand that the nature of these marriages until Joseph Smith made her one of his plural wives. So she didn't know at the time that the Fanny affair could be a marriage. And she knew what was going on. She did talk about knowing that Emma made a fuss over it and kicked Fanny out. Fanny left. So um, I my charitable interpretation of the situation would be that Joseph Smith considered it a marriage and that Oliver Cowdery and Emma did not. They thought it was, Cowdery thought it was a dirty, filthy, nasty scrape or affair. Um, and Emma, by her reaction, didn't accept any notion of that. I think she was referring to this when she told William E. McClellan later in Nauvoo that Joseph Smith practiced both adultery and polygamy. So I think she considered this Fanny as an affair, as an adulterous affair. And not that he couldn't repent from it like anyone else, but um, then so Oliver Cowdery confronted him in Missouri, and Joseph Smith said in front of witnesses, well, you never heard me confess that I committed adultery, did you? And Oliver Cowdery says, no, you never confessed to committing adultery is the key word. Um, there was also another reason Joseph Smith brought it up was that in Ohio, when the hierarchy of the church, some of the members were squabbling over this or that, and usually at the bottom of it was, I heard you said, and Joseph Smith made everyone covenant with each other that they will never accept rumor, and they would always check with the person themselves first before they made any accusations or conclusions about things. And Cowdery had not done that. So he was trying to tell Cowdery, well, you shouldn't be accusing me in public like this. You've broken covenant and promise. Um, and plus he said he never confessed to committing adultery, could imply that he believed it was a marriage of some kind. But what kind of marriage? Okay. I don't believe later accounts by um, Levi Hancock, um, uh, um, that Mosiah Hancock later claimed that his father, Levi Hancock, had performed a marriage. And the marriage was just, a ceremony, much like a plural marriage would be, and uh, all the trappings and secrecy and all that all sounds like what was going on in Utah at the time that Mosiah Hancock's making this account,
Mm.
writing it in his father's journal, actually adding it to his journal. So I don't believe that it was a formal marriage like Brigham Young practiced in Utah. Joseph Smith's practice was quite different, given that it had to be all secret. It wasn't in the open. And um, uh, so we shouldn't confuse Joseph Smith's practice of plural marriage with Brigham Young's practice. They were quite different situations and different circumstances, and more formal in Utah, formal ceremonies and sealings and all that stuff. And Joseph Smith was not the same. Um, so I'm not sure, and I doubt that there was any officiator. And one account tries to say that Oliver Cowdery was the officiator, and that's highly doubtful, you know, given Cowdery's um, rejection of polygamy altogether. Um,
Hmm.
so Joseph Smith, I believe, could have operated on just God revealing to him that Fanny was given to him by God, and that would be the authority, the command or authority to perform the marriage or assume the marriage was sanctioned by God without any ceremony whatsoever. Um, or Joseph could perform the ordinance himself, just speaking the words to Fanny, and that was a ceremony. That was be like what the model I take for that theory would be Alma in the Book of Mormon, who baptizes himself after the Spirit came on upon him. So there was no officiator in that ordinance, and in the Book of Mormon makes it sound valid. Um, so that's where I kind of come down on it. That I believe Joseph Smith uh, could have believed that he was actually married. He uh, God had said that the practice was valid, that he had gotten a revelation that she was meant to be his, and he acted on it. Now, how it was done, the social circumstances and the ceremony and all of that, that's nobody. Joe Smith would not have known that. He would have only known that God sanctioned it. How to go about doing it would be another matter.
Hmm. Hmm. We're closing in on 2 hours here, and literally, I don't feel like we've even scratched the tip of the iceberg
No,
here with the
no,
questions the audience has presented, the stuff that I want to pursue. I actually want to see if it's possible that we could maybe have you come back on and delve into some more of these topics. I think we could have
sure.
an ongoing conversation about it. I did actually have a question that somebody asked. I want you to kind of give an overview of how you feel this work is going to be contributing to Mormon scholarship. But once somebody says, can you share what you feel are the major contributions of this book to the discussion of early Mormon history? And have you been able to offer new perspectives on previously established narratives through the research for this book?
It's like an hour by itself, but I would say that looking around at what has been written before, I mean, that's very helpful and all that, but no one has put it together quite this way. Certainly not, naturalistically, and given my sympathetic view of Joseph Smith as a pious deceiver or fraud, or however you want to say it, that I'm not trying, I don't characterize him as some villain, evil and lying just to get sex and power and, money. I see him as sincere, but willing to use deception or prevaricate on various matters in order to increase faith in his revelations, so that it would be more difficult to reject his revelations, which he believed in. And did he believe himself to be a prophet? I say yes. So from a non-Mormon secular view, this, I don't know how more sympathetic you can be. Then it's more detailed thanks to the Joseph Smith papers and all sorts of other additional research, not just them, but additional research, that things that we have now that we just haven't had available to us before, has given us insight into Joseph Smith that we haven't had before. Not that he's not a totally open book, because he's a public figure from very early on in life. So it's very difficult to peel back the layers to get at the, inner workings of Joseph Smith and the way he thinks. I try my best to do that without getting too mind reading-ish, and so I think that overall the glimpse into his personal life is there. There's several threads that run through that have never run through any biography for sure, and that's on the development of priesthood authority, the development of his theology during the middle period of his life, the actual mechanisms at play, the politicalness of some of his revelations, and trying to hold the church together. This kind of thing has never even been done before, really. Either their revelations, God commanding him to organize the 12, and so he organizes the 12. There's no like forces at play in which this all makes sense, and the interweaving of all of these different threads that my book does has not been done before. And I think it's, everybody thinks they write a book that changes everything, but
well, you're
but
obviously...
I think it's going to change the dialogue. I hope it changes the dialogue and raises it to a level. It's not the final word. Nothing is ever the
Right.
final word. Scholarship is like an ongoing dialogue in slow motion. It takes decades to get
Yeah.
anywhere, and that's why I'm really sad at some of the more conservative things that have appeared on the internet, especially lately, trying to deny all the progress that we've made with more progressive Mormon historians, right? In recent years, we're reaching a consensus on various matters to where I think we'll probably reach a place where it's impossible to tell the difference between Joseph Smith, people who believe in Joseph Smith as a prophet, and people who don't. The only difference will be faith.
Hmm.
And so that's kind of what I have to
Yeah.
say.
So
I hope people read it and
yeah,
decide for themselves.
and it's a great read. And I just want to say, I want to know, okay, so this of course, you've had a decades long relationship with Signature Books and Smith Pettit Foundation, and they say this is part of a trilogy of books now.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
so I want to know this book, how it's viewed. I actually was surprised when I opened this up. This is part of a trilogy. So we have A Natural Born Seer by Richard S. Van Wagener, and then we have Glory that covers the period 1805 to 1830, and Glorious in Persecution, Joseph Smith, American Prophet, 1839 to 1844. So I kind of thought this was kind of like your next book after The Making of the Prophet. Is that are you going to be doing some more work in addition to after this? I mean, explain to me where this book fits in within your uh, how I should view it. Is this part two of your Joseph Smith work, or is this
Yeah. You can
trilogy?
look at it as that
Yeah.
and part of that trilogy and part
Okay.
of my own trilogy.
Right.
so so um so I wrote The Making of a Prophet, and it was published in 2004. And then in 2005, for Joseph Smith's 200th year uh, birth anniversary of his birth, Signature Books started this idea of a trilogy on Joseph Smith's life, and they assigned the first part that dealt with the same period of time that my book dealt with to Richard Van Wagener, who wrote Natural Born Seer. And I read it in the manuscript form and
Okay.
offered suggestions. And I wasn't part of this project at all.
Right.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And so I read that and I gave my suggestions, and unfortunately Richard passed away before it was published. It's a fine book. It's written from a different perspective than what I did, and of course I went through the Book of Mormon in vast detail to show especially autobiographical influences and possible um, environmental influences. um, but Richard didn't do that, of course, and he wrote a different type of biography that is really valuable in its own right. Um, the middle part was assigned to somebody else, and then the latter part in Nauvoo was assigned to uh, Margaret Evans, and she did a fine job there too. And I read that in the manuscript and made suggestions. And uh, uh, I mean, and it's a fine contribution on the Nauvoo period. It's pretty big itself, I think, just for 4.5 year period of Justman's life. Um, so then a lot of years passed without the person producing the middle part,
Okay.
and it was finally given up, abandoned, uh, and they approached me, and I accepted to do it because I
Okay.
wanted to do it anyway. It was the next book I was going to write about Joseph Smith's anyway. So I decided to accept the task and uh, negotiated for a 5 year contract or 4 year contract. And then I got to work on it. Um, so
Hmm.
I've only been working on it, even though there's a long gap from what to the 2000 and whatever it was when Martha published her book. Um, uh, there was a long gap, but I was only involved for the last 5 years, actually, until now,
Okay.
in it, writing it. And and I do plan on going on and doing the
Okay.
Nauvoo in my own fashion. And so you get another perspective. There's always need for more and more perspectives on Joe Smith, such a complicated person.
So this is part two of two trilogies, basically.
Yeah, kind of.
Okay. Okay. Thanks for sorting that out for me because I was a little confused when I saw that, and I was like, oh, because I thought you were working on some more stuff. So the question then is when is your next book planning? What's your game plan to have your next book completed? How far along are on it at this point?
Well, I haven't really started.
Oh,
Okay.
so this is okay.
And I'm really enjoying making videos on various Mormon topics for my YouTube channel.
Yes.
Um, and I just published a video, hour and a half video on the magic parchments that were handed down in the Hiram Smith family.
Yep.
And what do they mean? And I found a lot of new stuff that's never been discovered about it. I corrected some of what I think Quinn was mistaken about on these documents. Um, and so that was great fun. I kept falling down one rabbit hole after another. That's one reason why I delayed accepting interviews for this book, was I was too excited about what I was finding in regard to those parchments. It was too much fun. So,
Yeah.
and I couldn't stop, and I didn't want to stop my momentum, and um, so I finished that, and now I'm working on uh, the Seer Stone Deniers,
Yes.
and I will
Jonathan
be
Neville.
I will be including his book in this. Um, so yeah, I'm reading that book and making notes and collecting stuff for a video on that topic.
All
Will be my
right.
next topic. But I'm focusing on the Book of Mormon with Brian Hale's things and various apologetic so-called proofs. And so I have fun. I have to go according to what I like to do. I have attention deficit anyway, and if I don't like it, I can't do it.
Yeah,
And
I get it. I get it. Well, that, and just to remind folks, yeah, check out Dan's YouTube channel. As a matter of fact, your years period of time on the Book of Abraham was amazing. Oh my
yeah,
goodness, it was astonishing. So that's why I didn't even talk about the Book of Abraham. I almost like, just watch the Book of Abraham series you have on your channel.
yeah,
It's really amazing.
8 videos,
Yeah,
and I transformed them into a book.
that's
So
right.
yeah, so I transformed those videos into a book with more additional information and presented it in a different way. And my basic arguments I developed during the making of those videos work that way. And then I take books and things that I write and I turn them into videos. So
That's great. Yeah.
just to reach a different audience.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because you are definitely reaching a different audience with what you're doing. Of course, last year you did something on Freemasonry, and I need to have you back on to talk about the Book of Abraham. We could actually do a whole thing on the Book of Abraham because I have your book on it too. So let's do that.
Oh yeah.
So this has really just been a fantastic interview. I really enjoyed it, and I just want to say I really feel like we only just scratched the surface, and I want to have you come back on. But folks, I just a reminder:
Sure.
get this book. All right, add this to your collection. This is an invaluable resource for whether you're a believer or a skeptic or just a scholar, or in many cases, evangelicals who like to study Mormonism through my channel. This is a book that I recommend to have as part of your studies as well. And so Dan Vogel, the man, the myth, the legend, one of the most awesome people on the planet. Thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you.
And so again, I feel like we're going to continue this conversation, folks, and I just want to thank all of you for those of you who are financially supporting the channel. You can support me via Patreon as well as on PayPal. Also, don't forget our merch store, MormonBookReviews.com, where you can get hot chocolate mugs, not coffee mugs, hot chocolate mugs, ball caps, you name it. It's also available on the merch store. That's MormonBookReviews.com. Don't forget to enter the book contest. And remember, the most important thing is this, folks. Remember, all the voices of the restoration will be heard here on Mormon Book Reviews.